In today's World Insight, G7 leaders gather in Japan's Hiroshima for their annual summit with an eye on the world economy, the conflict in Ukraine, and global food security. What's the likely outcome of the summit? And China's special rep on Eurasian affairs on a peace mission for 5 nations in Europe, starting with Ukraine. What are the prospects of a diplomatic settlement?
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. This week, the G7, or group of 7 nations, the United States, Japan, Germany, Britain, France, Canada, and Italy, are gathering in the Japanese city of Hiroshima for the G7 summit. The group is set to discuss a variety of issues, including economic security, sensitive technologies, the Ukraine conflict, and food security. Also on the agenda are artificial intelligence advances like ChatGPT and stepping up engagement with developing countries, the so-called Global South. So what more can be expected from the G7 meeting? Some think Japan, as the chair of this year's summit, may take up interest in military alliances, which could fuel regional tensions. Although the G7 was founded in 1970 to bring stability to the world economic order, there are concerns that the G7 may be straying into military confrontation. For more on all these questions, let's talk to our panelists. Joining us in Washington, D.C., Surabh Gupta, Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist with the Institute for China-American Studies. In Tokyo, Kato Yoshikatsu, Research Fellow at the Rakuten Securities Economic Institute. In Beijing, Zhao Hai, Director of the International Political Studies with National Institute of Global Strategy. Welcome to the three of you, gentlemen. G7 summit to be held later in the week. Is it going to be a united, quote-unquote, summit as the U.S. President Biden would hope?
I think for our Prime Minister Kishida, I think because Hiroshima, the venue this time is his hometown, and Hiroshima, everybody knows it's a kind of the symbol of peace. But at the same time, now Japan is going to take more proactive actions in international circumstances. So how to, for our Prime Minister to demonstrate our willingness to maintain peace and stability, this is, I think, a top priority for Kishida.
Overall, I think the projection of unity is important for the G7, and they will project that particularly on the Ukraine issue, and also with what it views as China's more assertive moves in the Indo-Pacific.
How is China looking at a grouping like this at this moment?
Well, I think for China, G7 remains as a wealthy nations club. And so far, if you're looking at their foreign minister's statement, they're concerned about a lot of issues, global challenges. On the one hand, they expressed their willingness to cooperate with China on various issues. However, they spend a large portion of that statement on how to actually contain China and unify among themselves to get to that point. So for China, when they talk about unity, our question is united for what? If this G7 is united for global development, peace, and prosperity, of course, we support that. However, if that unity is aimed at China and other developing countries, then we have, I think, in the future, a huge problem.
So how do you see the challenges, economically speaking, G7 as a whole are facing? After all, it is the developed economies, the nature of the G7.
Good question. The G7 has some really hard issues to sort through on the economic front this year. We have financial crises, the banking sector crises, and the potential recession that you talked about. And the G7 used to be very good at engendering and fostering prosperity 25 years back, but those days have passed. If there is going to be prosperity in the international system, it will mostly have to now come from the new emerging markets, which are the pillars of growth on an annual basis.
How do you see members of the G7 are trying to sort out the credibility of the U.S. economy and also work with the so-called unity on economic front?
I think now it's a great challenge for G7, and maybe Japan, maybe like China, Japan has less confidence on U.S. economy, or now the bank sector is in the bankruptcy or financial crisis. So it's a great challenge for Japanese economy. And at the same time, we need to face and coordinate our economic policy with China as well. Now we can see some division among G7 countries and less confidence. So how to maintain or reverse our economic policy or macroeconomic policy? It's in the post-COVID era. This is a great challenge for G7 this time.
How do you see the economic front on the challenges of the G7 and their ability so far to be able to sort out these challenges together?
And I think this so-called debt ceiling is self-created crisis by the US itself and by its political system. I think there are many people focused on this issue because essentially this is a domestic political issue. They're fighting for the future budget and direction of the United States. So nobody else can help the United States solve that. And that's why Biden needs to focus on its domestic issues. However, that has great implications and ramifications around the globe. And G7 countries will be impacted by the decision made within the United States. And also, not all countries in G7 share the same economic structure. Some of the countries like Japan and Germany are like China, they're exporting countries, and some countries like mainly the United States are importing countries. So I think on the global stage, both sides needs to coordinate their policy so that they can have a balanced global economy moving forward and particularly helping the economic recovery.
How do you see, Mr. Zhao, the competing agenda between economic trade vis-a-vis geopolitical and politics at the G7 summit this time?
It's getting more and more conflicting between the two because right now the United States are advocating for a new global system, a new international order. Previously, they emphasized on the rule-based international order. However, they pick and choose of what comply to their own interest, and then they will buy that international order, and then something they will just give up. And right now, if you listen to the recent speech by Sullivan, the US National Security Advisor, he's talking about a new consensus, a new Washington consensus. And in that, on the one hand, the US wanted to adopt a new industrial policy and produce everything domestically. However, on the other hand, they're saying they wanted to include other allies from Europe and including Japan and other Asia partners. However, if you look inside exactly how can they reconcile the conflicting concept within that system, it's still very much a question. So I would see a very interesting debate during this time, G7 in Japan and other countries would pose the same question to the United States and asking exactly what they're trying to do for the future international order, and will that order still be open and actually like what the US advocating, a free and open in the free and open Indo-Pacific.
If you look at the IMF latest prediction, Asia Pacific is going to be the driving force of economic growth worldwide for the year 2023. Mr. Kato, and China likely to contribute about more than 30% of that, India more than 10%, the whole Asia Pacific region more than 60 to 70%. So that's a huge chunk. So at this point, will Asia Pacific remain an engine of growth, especially for economic growth, which is one of the most urgent tasks that face every country these days? Is a big question mark. If constructively, what G7 could do in making sure that will happen?
Sure. From a Japanese perspective, Asia Pacific should remain our driving engine for the world economy, and this Japan should be shouldn't be absent. We need to engage, and now we are looking at some European leaders attitude toward China, like Emmanuel Macron or Germany's Prime Minister. From last year to this year, they are continuously visiting China, and they are bringing a lot of businessmen to continue to invest in China. So I think China is indispensable for recovery of world economy. So this is, I think, undeniable reality, and Japan is in it. So, and this is very important. But now, as I said, in terms of unity of G7, so how could we restore the world economy, and how could we take advantage of Asia the power of Asia Pacific. In this sense, I think now Japan is a member from Asia. So we need to have some responsibility to speak out how important Asia Pacific is or should be for world economy.
Will the role of G7 summit this time be one limited to quote-unquote sanctions toward some countries, for example, Russia? Or will it become more constructive in suggesting ways and working on the ways to make sure the conflicting parties, Russia and Ukraine, will be able to come to the talking table? What will be the role of the G7 this time, and should be the role?
Yeah, what I think the G7 is going to do is basically find a means to provide, come to a consensus on finding means to provide some sort of security arrangements or guarantees to the Ukrainians, to that part of Ukraine which remains under Kyiv's control once the conflict phase, the hot conflict phase is over. I think that's an important discussion. Ukraine has been given a chance to recoup as much territory, but I think the G7 is trying to get its act together and trying to see what the peace will look like. And that's why it's really important and useful that China is a participant separately in that whole process at this given point of time.
I think now, since the February 24th last year, G7 members, including Japan, sanction, and giving a huge pressure against Russia, and providing any kinds of support to Ukraine. So I really hope this time we could have very open discussion to truly resolve the crisis from long-term perspective.
Mr. Zhao, I also want to invite your opinion. Of course, China's special envoy, Ambassador Li Hui, is in the region of Europe, trying to talk to some of the key players, including talking to the conflicting parties, Russia and Ukraine, in order for G7 to be playing a constructive role. What do you think should be the focus of discussion if they could really do that on the issue of the Russian-Ukraine conflict?
Well, first of all, I don't think G7 can resolve the current crisis in Ukraine. On the contrary, I think that crisis needs to be resolved by the two sides, the Russians and the Ukrainians. And the Chinese side right now, the special envoy is trying to send the message and going around to collect all the parties who are involved, their interest and their conditions for stopping this horrible war. Like many other crises, I think G7 talk about Iran, North Korea, and all the other so-called problems in this world. However, if you look into it, the ultimate problem lies with the United States, because in many peace process, the U.S. is the first one who's quitting, and the U.S. is the first one who's renegades on their own promises, their own commitments, like in the deal with North Korea, and the deal with Iran. So moving forward, if the United States cannot commit to whatever negotiations and peace settlement with all these hotspot issues, then we're having a huge problem. And for that, I hope that G6 will stand up to the United States and push the United States to make up their mind and commit and stick to their promises so that we can have a more peaceful world moving forward.
Final question for all of you on technology. I understand as the host of the G7 summit, Japan has raised that issue and hope that it could be part of the top agenda. How do you see the fact that technologies have becoming such an important entry point for future stability, peace?
All countries understand at early stages of technology, you provide what is called a regulatory sandbox. Let these guys innovate, the players innovate. And then when they grow big, they need to be subject to regulation. And the US is an outlier in terms of digital policy and AI regulation also. And that goes to the real problem out here, different approaches, and therefore the difficulty in projecting unity when they all have very different stances on this, with the US being on the outside looking in rather than on the inside.
I think now, AI, high tech, I think this will include the different kind of dimensions. For example, this could be a driving force for sustainability. But at the same time, including AI, these technology would be weaponized or politicized among major powers. So maybe it would create more conflicts, among major powers.
Well, I think we're already too late on the regulations on AI, and the AI's development is breaking all the barriers, and it's much more developed than we can imagine. So I think in the future, what we need is not just G7 forming up a unity of policy to regulate AI, but globally.
Thank you so much for the three of you contributing your ideas and thoughts. Appreciate it.